They're here to protect me, collecting my financial information and my financial records. It's one thing to know how people...
The gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to give the gentleman 4 additional minutes.
The gentleman may continue.
Collecting information from the American people on their phone records is one thing. Knowing who you call and when you call. It is something far different, Mr. Speaker, when you see how they spend, where they spend, when they spend. You want to know about America? Take their financial records. And so all we say in this reform package is give them a choice. If you're here to protect them, ask them and say, we want to take your financial data and information. Are you okay with that? If you're here to protect the consumer, why wouldn't you ask them? We require the CFPB to make that ask. And there's an important reason behind it. Because, as many folks in this body understand, that in politics, you can get a good representation of the whole by sampling data, taking a small segment of the whole and getting a representation of the whole body. And that's what the CFPB could do if they wanted good market data on how things are working. Because I do think they need data. They need information. But that's not what they're doing. They're not sampling. They're taking almost 1 billion credit cards and the information from those. And, Mr. Speaker, they don't keep that information for a month. They don't want to keep it for a year. They want to keep your financial data for over 10 years. They want to keep your financial data for over 10 years. This is unacceptable. And for my colleagues across the aisle to say that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is only protecting consumers and there's no need for reform is a misstatement. There is plenty of room for reform in a very powerful, very unaccountable agency that's accessing financial information from Americans in a way that they would find unacceptable. And so, as we debate this rule, I hope that my friends across the aisle will see the pure-hearted spirit and effort that has been made to actually make the CFPB more effective and more accountable to the consumer. And so with that, I would yield back, and I thank the gentleman from Texas for offering me the time.
We reserve our time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Further, I want to clarify the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is already prohibited from collecting personally identifiable information in the course of its market monitoring responsibilities to make sure that American consumers are not taken advantage of. I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Quigley.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, how quickly do some forget? When Congress created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, we did so on behalf of every constituent unfairly defrauded during the financial crisis. As a Cook County Commissioner in 2007, I remember the financial crisis and the damage it did to Chicago's communities. I remember when your credit card rate was about how well you could read fine print, not how regular you paid your bill. I remember when auto financing could be based on a whim, not your credit history, and when home buyers were pushed into loans no one could ever expect them to repay. I remember when it was open season on our veterans, when a whole industry was made up defrauding our returning sons and daughters. But I also remember how many of my colleagues characterized the creation of the CFPB, calling it a bureaucratic behemoth that would devastate credit markets and make lending impossible. Yet here we are today with a growing economy and a vibrant credit market. Only now we do it with fair practices, protecting American consumers and treating them with dignity. So I reject this attempt today to undermine the CFPB and the progress we've made. We simply can't afford to return to the free-for-all that existed pre-crisis. H.R. 3193 is either a bad case of congressional amnesia or an attack on the most important financial reform of a generation. Either way, it is ill-cited, and I urge my colleagues to defeat this effort. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman from Colorado for yielding time. I rise today in opposition to H.R. 3193. Congress created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in response to a regulatory system that couldn't keep pace with the needs and the entities it oversaw. The system was neither agile enough nor properly equipped for protecting consumers. The financial crisis exposed subprime lending practices that preyed on the most vulnerable consumers. It uncovered obscene credit card contracts that put working families underwater. And it found student loans that left our next generation more worried about their interest rates than about changing the world. The list goes on. The CFPB was our answer to these and prospective concerns. It is the only independent agency that is tasked with protecting consumers, our constituents. Free from the political melee, this watchdog focuses on making sure that markets are fair and players follow the rules. The CFPB may not be perfect. Undoubtedly, missteps may occur. But that's why the agency is subject to regular audits and why the government maintains ways of addressing flawed rules. I'm willing and eager to work with my colleagues to improve the CFPB to ensure that the American people are properly protected. But that's not what this bill does. This bill scraps the intention of the agency and re-exposes our families and our students to the same unfair and undue risks which necessitated the agency's creation in the first place. I urge my colleagues to use this agency to help protect their constituents and to address their concerns. Remember your constituents when you vote today. I ask my colleagues to join in opposition to this measure and the underlying bill. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin.
The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, the gentleman from Texas. Listen, I'm hearing the arguments across the aisle about how the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is protecting consumers and protecting America from unfair practices and risks in the financial sector. But I guess I would challenge my friends across the aisle to tell me, how is that mission of protecting consumers diluted if we go from a single payer to a commission, which was originally their idea? How is this diluted if they go to a pay scale set by Congress and not by themselves? That doesn't impact their ability to work on consumer protection issues. Why are consumer protection issues impacted if we give a similar and same voice to small community banks and credit unions, the same that they've given in this bill to big Wall Street banks? You're still protecting consumers. There's nothing in here that prohibits the CFPB's ability to do their job. And finally, how are we hurting consumers by making sure that the CFPB asks them first before they get their information? I guess I haven't heard those comments being made. I'm hearing a lot of platitudes, a lot of comments at 30,000 feet that have nothing to do with the reform package that's here in the House today. I would enjoy hearing my friends across the aisle talk about what's actually in the bill. It's not immigration. It's protecting consumers from the CFPB. And you're bringing up issues, Mr. Speaker, they're bringing up issues that aren't relevant. One other issue I want to clarify, which is in regard to personally identifiable information. 2 points. Information has been very clearly made to us that, one, the CFPB isn't following the directive of the statute, number one, but number two, the amount of information that the CFPB has, the quantity, the amount, it's easily reverse engineered, simply re-engineered to find out who the individual is. So if I have your zip code +4, your date of birth, your age, all of this information, I might not have your name, but in an instant, I can get your name because I have all the data I need to do just that. That's not protecting consumers. So I think if you want to have a debate about protecting consumers and having an agency that's accountable to Congress, I would love to have that debate. But when we bring up issues that aren't in the bill, it's pretty hard to have an honest and fair conversation about that, Mr. Speaker. And with that, I yield back to the Chairman.
Reserve our time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Duffy is correct that immigration reform is not in the bill or the rule. It should be, but it's not. We have another motion for something that should be in the bill, but is not. Mr. Speaker, last week we provided the House 2 opportunities to consider flood insurance reform, a bipartisan measure that now has almost 200 co-sponsors, but unfortunately it was denied. Not only does this bill not have immigration reform, it also does not have flood insurance reform. Today we're offering members another chance to put aside party politics and do something that's important for the American people. If we defeat the previous question, I'll offer an amendment to the rule to bring up the bill that would delay flood insurance premium hikes and provide relief to thousands of American families. To discuss this proposal, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Castor.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague from Colorado for yielding the time. I rise to encourage all of our colleagues to vote no on the rule, no on the previous question, and on the underlying bill. It has been 2 weeks since the Senate passed a bipartisan fix to the exorbitant rise in flood insurance rates across the country. But it has been particularly dismaying that in the past 2 weeks, the GOP-controlled House has not taken up the Senate-passed bill or the House version to provide some relief for hardworking families across the country. Because there's been no action, we are asking today that all members come together to vote no on the previous question so we can take up the flood insurance fix bill. Now, many of us have been working in a bipartisan way for much longer than 2 weeks. For many months, we've had bipartisan proposals here in the House, but for some reason, the GOP leadership has been resistant to bringing up this bipartisan solution. I've offered an amendment on every piece of legislation passing through the Rules Committee since November for a flood insurance fix, but again, the Republicans have refused to make it in order. So our only, without any scheduling of a bill yet, we have to resort to going to the previous question. Now, if you take a step back, you know, flood insurance reform was very well intentioned. The reform bill was passed in 2012, intended to make the trust fund, the flood insurance trust fund, solvent, especially after Superstorm Sandy. The flood insurance trust fund, that's the backstop to economic security for many families, was insolvent. So we came together, passed a reform bill. The problem is it hasn't been implemented in the right way. FEMA has actually implemented it in an irrational way. It's not affordable. They have problems with mapping. And what this does, it creates a very troublesome path to eventual solvency of the trust fund. People are not going to be able to pay into the trust fund like they should. So what's happening? Families are facing exorbitant, unconscionable increases, depressed home values, inability to buy or sell a home.
Could I? Additional 30 seconds.
Thank you.
From Florida.
And here's another concern. Do you remember how difficult it was for the House, the GOP House, to actually provide the emergency aid when Superstorm Sandy hit? 179 Republicans voted against the emergency aid, so that makes it even more important that we fix the flood insurance trust fund, so that it's there for families who need it. Last week I pointed out that many are very skeptical that the Republicans in Congress will act in support of the middle class, in support of small businesses across America. Well, I asked my friends on the other side of the aisle, prove them wrong, let's come together, vote no on the previous question, and let's move the flood insurance
time has expired. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Colorado.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
The gentlewoman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to follow up on my good friend and colleague from Florida's comments on behalf of homeowners in South Florida and around the nation who are trying to maintain affordable flood insurance coverage, and I urge the House leadership to bring the Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act to a vote today. Through the National Flood Insurance Program, millions of homeowners benefit from the ability to purchase affordable coverage, including thousands of South Florida families. Now, while we understand the need to keep the National Flood Program financially stable, we must do so while ensuring that these families can afford the coverage on their homes, or they won't have coverage. Surging premiums destabilize our recovering housing market, and they cause uncertainty for homeowners. The system cannot withstand these increases, and we must act to fix it. I want to thank my colleagues in the Senate who in a bipartisan way passed this legislation, and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle who make up the 207 bipartisan co-sponsors here in the House of Representatives who want to pass this bill into law. This is essential. We can't allow this to go on. Mr. Speaker, our nation's homeowners can't afford to wait any longer. We need to defeat the previous question and vote on this bipartisan agreement today. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields. The gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much, and I thank the gentlewomen who from Florida bring up this issue again. And we spoke about this issue last week, how it is actually a $24 billion problem to the taxpayer. It is also equally a very difficult lift financially on the problems that it is creating to homeowners who live in flood areas. As was noted last week, FEMA did not complete their job. We have known about this. This is not a new issue, and the numerous members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, are trying very diligently to work on this and have been. I want to acknowledge the work that has been put in by both these members and others, including the gentleman from Florida, Judge Hastings, who sits on the Rules Committee, including the gentleman that sit on and gentlewoman that sit on the Rules Committee from Florida. There are a total of 4 people out of 13 on the Rules Committee that live in Florida. This is a nationwide problem wherever those people live, predominantly along coastal areas. We are working on it, but it's a $24 billion problem that was not addressed by the Senate. Not addressed. And what we're trying to do is to work with the chairman of the Financial Services Committee, the gentleman, Mr. Hensley, as well as the ranking member and the committee on getting an answer. And as I've stated to people numerous times, I do appreciate not only them keeping this issue in the forefront, but it is something that we must address in the Rules Committee. We intend to do that. I reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, the Democratic whip, Mr. Hoyer.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman from Colorado for yielding. I thank my colleagues from Florida for being on the floor. And I rise to urge my colleagues to defeat the previous question so that instead we can call up a bipartisan bill to alleviate the anxiety of millions of homeowners, flood-prone areas, and their flood insurance premiums won't become simply unaffordable. Should we do any less? Twice already we've had the votes in this House to bring up this bill, a companion of which passed the Senate with a bipartisan vote of 68 to 32 on January 30th. There's no reason why this bill wouldn't pass overwhelmingly. But once again, partisan politics has wedged itself in between Congress's best intentions and the potential for achieving results. It is surprising that Republican members from flood-prone districts have twice voted to block this bill from coming to the floor and to deprive their constituents of the assistance they need and the reinsurance they deserve. Sometimes party asks too much. Sometimes party asks for votes which will hurt your constituents. Rise above party and vote for your people. We should not repeat the overwhelming delay that occurred in supplying assistance in response to Superstorm Sandy. After that storm, the Republican leadership blocked Congress from taking action on emergency disaster funding for more than 90 days. The continued obstruction of this bipartisan flood insurance bill is an unfortunate continuation of that same trend of letting partisanship get in the way of doing what is right. I know there are many of our colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle that want to do what is right for their constituents. Do not let party regularity dissuade you from doing the right thing. I appeal to them, Mr. Speaker, to support their constituents, not their party, by setting partisanship aside, working with us to defeat the previous question, and allowing the House to vote on the Grim Waters legislation, a bipartisan piece of legislation that will make sure homeowners don't find themselves underwater in more ways than one. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that the previous question, what does that mean? Our constituents, Mr. Speaker, must be watching. What's Hoyer talking about previous question? What are others talking about the previous question? It is simply a vote by which it says that if the previous question is not approved, that we can offer the bipartisan
Yield an additional 30 seconds to the gentleman from Maryland.
I thank the gentleman. So that we can offer the bipartisan legislation to give the relief that is so desperately needed now. Not 90 days from now, now. So defeat this previous question, and my Republican colleagues, if you care about your flood-ravaged and flood-risk constituents, vote no on the previous question. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Maryland yields. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'll yield myself 1 minute.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I do appreciate the distinguished gentleman from Maryland coming down. And once again, I would tend to not just acknowledge what the gentleman is asking for, but I will speak to it. The problem is that we have to worry about the solvency of the program. The program is some $24 billion in the red right now, and not addressing its solvency and just to give some new program the life rather than fixing it correctly is where we politely disagree. We believe that the ability that we have in this Congress with this issue is to do it right, where it's in the best interest of people back home, that I care about, that every member of this body cares about, but also the financial integrity to the taxpayer. The national debt is a tremendous national embarrassment, and we are not going to just waive a $24 billion that will become a $50 billion problem. That's why we're trying to address the
time is expired.
I reserve my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Maryland.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I share my friend's view that we need to be worried about the solvency of our nation. We haven't done such a good job at that, and we're, by the way, going to have a bill on the floor pretty soon which won't do much for that either, somewhat irresponsibly in my view. But the solvency that I'm worried about right now is the guy who lives in a $190,000 home with his family and has got a $25,000 premium facing him. It's going to, yearly, annual premium, it's going to make him move out of his home. But the problem he's going to have is nobody's going to buy his home.
Gentleman's time has expired.
We need to act.
Gentleman from Texas.
Reserve my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Garcia.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
I'd like to thank my colleague from Colorado for yielding, and I want to recognize precisely what the gentleman from Maryland was talking about. I'd like to urge my colleagues to vote no on the previous question so we can get to this important issue. And I appreciate the gentleman from Texas's understanding of this. But I want to talk about the Homeowners Flood Insurance Affordability Act, which is a bipartisan bill which would delay crippling premium increases that are affecting people throughout South Florida and throughout the country. And I don't want to talk about specific people. Mr. Speaker, because of the raise of flood insurance rates, people are literally walking away from their homes. I recently spoke to Derek and Robin Menard. They had an increase because the property owner of where they rent put it on their bill, and so they could not afford to remain in South Florida because it just got too expensive. After 9 years of calling South Florida home, they were forced to move away. They're now forced to find jobs where they've moved to in Pennsylvania. They had to pull their little daughter, Millie, out of school, and she had to change friends and neighborhood. Mr. Speaker, this is not right, and while I recognize the gentleman from Texas wants to solve this, we have a bipartisan bill that was passed out of the Senate. We can pass this out now and then get to working on this problem before we hurt more people, before we force more people to move away from their community, their friends, their loved ones, due to these exorbitant insurance rates. So for this reason, I urge my colleagues to defeat the previous question so we can pass a bipartisan bill that makes common sense and provides a solution and much-needed relief to policyholders. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of our time.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I don't consider it common sense or the right thing to do. $24 billion irresponsibility is once again what the Democrat Party is pushing today on the floor of this House of Representatives. I'd yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Wisconsin.
The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have to acknowledge I'm a little disheartened that my friends across the aisle are encouraging defeat of a rule that would bring a vote to protect consumers from having the CFPB collect financial data on them. I know my friends want to talk about flood insurance, and we're no doubt going to have that day to have that conversation, and it's important. But the bottom line today is, the conversation today is that we protect consumers from having their information collected on them, just like the NSA is collecting phone records on Americans. Let's stand together. Let's protect the middle class. Let's protect small community banks and financial institutions. That's the vote today. Stand with us. Let's move the ball forward for middle-class, hard-working families who want to keep their information and their data to themselves. And let's move forward at a date soon to be acknowledged on flood insurance. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Frankel.
The gentlewoman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this great country of ours has weathered hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, and fires. Now our families in Florida and across the nation are confronting a man-made crisis created unintentionally by past acts of this Congress. Mr. Speaker, an economic storm is brewing. Just ask my constituents, the Woodlaws, who live in a modest home in Lauderdale by the Sea. They've paid off their mortgage and now pay $2,400 a year in flood insurance. But now, because of Congress's past actions, they face a $12,000 bill for the same coverage that they cannot afford, and now they are one flood away from financial disaster. Our constituents, like the Woodlaws, are facing skyrocketing jumps in flood insurance premiums unless we act now, Mr. Speaker, to take up the bipartisan Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act. Mr. Speaker, a storm is brewing. Thank you. I yield back my time.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentleman from Texas.
Time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Florida, my colleague on the Rules Committee, Mr. Hastings.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 30 seconds.
My friend. I'd like to first say and credit the chairman of the Rules Committee for having addressed this problem. He has spoken about it to me and others. The same holds for my co-chair of the Florida delegation, Vern Buchanan. All of us in the Florida delegation, minus one person, are supportive of this particular measure. Here is an opportunity, then, for us to defeat the previous question and bring this matter up now. Enough already of continuing to discuss it. We've had ample time to deal with this problem. And don't forget, Florida, among other states, is a donor state in this business. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers at this time, and I will choose to wait, reserve my time, and close. Thank you.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman from Colorado and the gentleman from Texas. What we can do is really do our work and pass comprehensive immigration reform to really deal with the pain of so many in this country. But I do believe that we should defeat the previous question so that my constituents in Texas along the coastline can stop paying $8,000 in flood insurance. It is absolutely absurd. A bill has passed. We're ready to go. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I think it is important that we discuss H.R. 3193 that wants to undo the corrections that we made to save America's jobs, homes, life savings, and pensions when we reformed Wall Street. We believe in the capitalistic system. We just don't believe in the abusive capitalistic system. And the Consumer Protection Agency that has been put in place to help consumers with credit cards, and other matters dealing with their financial needs is now being imploded by this legislation. What do we have to say to speak for the people of the United States? Effectively defending this bill effectively defunds the CPPS. What we want to do is continue the Consumer Protection Board, continue the leverage that is given to protect consumers. I have actually heard from consumers who have said, thank you. We now have a board that will hear our voices and that will express our concerns with what kind of treatment we're getting from financial agencies. Let's move on behalf of the American people now, not special interests. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
I reserve the balance of my time.
Mr. Speaker, I'm through with all my speakers, and I would choose to reserve my time and letting the gentleman run down.
Gentleman reserved. Gentleman from Colorado.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's been clear, and we actually have some bipartisan agreement here about what this bill lacks. This bill does not do anything about hundreds of people sneaking across our southern border every day. It does nothing to reunite American families. It does nothing to end over 2 million deportations that have occurred during the Obama administration. It also does nothing to address the imminent hikes in flood insurance that many Americans, including Americans in my home state of Colorado, face if Congress fails to act. So what does this bill that has preempted Congress, instead of dealing with illegal immigration, instead of dealing with flood insurance, what is this bill that we're here talking about do? It creates additional federal government bureaucracy. It takes one person's job and turns it into a commission of 5 people who will endlessly debate things rather than decide things. What if one is sick and there's 4 at work and it's deadlocked 2-2? And then the other one comes in and one is missing because the appointment is held up. Do we really need to have more government regulators in charge of this federal agency, Mr. Speaker? That's exactly what this bill does. One person can do the job. How many companies in this country are ran by a panel of 5 co-CEOs? I don't know of a single one. Not a single one. Why would we want to run a federal agency like that? The gamesmanship that we're doing in this House while there's important issues like illegal immigration and flood insurance is at a serious cost to the American people. The Senate passed the bipartisan immigration reform bill last June. The House hasn't dedicated a single minute of legislative floor time to an immigration reform bill. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of the amendment in the record along with the extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to vote no and defeat the previous question so we can deal with one of these pressing issues that my colleagues from Florida and other states have made a compelling case for here on the floor of the House today to address flood insurance. And I also urge a no vote on the rule. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I want to thank my colleagues from the Democratic Party for coming and once again offering their ideas about flood insurance. That's not part of the bill. I would simply reply to them, as I have previously, that the Senate offered compromise or the Senate offered language spends $900 million more, does not take care of the $24 billion problem, which is red ink that the taxpayer would pick up, which harms the solvency of the program. Why have a government program that runs in the red 24, then goes to $50 billion? That's not what we're going to do. We're going to come up with an answer in the House of Representatives. I expect it to be done quickly, and we're going to do that. But today, we're talking about the CFPB, and Americans have witnessed firsthand the negative effects of the CFPB, and we have looked at how this administration and one agency can not only gather records, but literally control a marketplace. I believe that what you have heard today lends us to understand that a balance of the CFPB is what's important. We brought 5 distinctly different bills to bear here, one of them saying that we should not have employees of the CFPB that are paid well outside of normal government standards, where even an intern who serves for this CFPB makes over $51,000. Mr. Speaker, what Republicans are trying to do is to balance the piece of legislation that passed this House with President Obama, Speaker Pelosi, Senator Reid. We're trying to offer a balance to that on behalf of the consumer, on behalf of a legislative process where members of Congress and the Financial Services Committee has an opportunity to work with any administration, not just the Democrats, on what the policy of the CFPB would be. Secondly, we think it's wrong that 900 million records, financial records, are taken without notice given to a consumer. We think that's not just an overreach. We think that's an abuse of power. When the government unilaterally has 900 million records, I would have to ask why. So, look, I support the rule. Yes on the rule. Yes on underlying legislation. I yield the balance of my time. Move the previous question on the resolution.
Gentleman yields. The question is on ordering the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker?
The gentleman is recognized.
On that, I'd like to request a recorded vote.
The gentleman, you're asking for the yeas and nays?
Yes.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. code is cold. Looks like both sides are trying to find their...
I was going to get full of things to you, but that might be over the top. Thanks, Doug.
I'm doing okay. Just waiting for our committee to show up. Just waiting for our committee to show up.
What's going on in your What's that? What's going on in your state? What are the hot buttons?
That's how we've done these.
Right, when you look at someone fix it, right, and then, you know, once you come out and get it's a hard problem. Kind of, it's a good one. It's your chance, sir. Yeah.
And I want people to listen to
During the military. So what's funny, because that
Sometimes like the amendment major substitution or clean out well, I'm grateful. I know. I thought you could do
I think your name's on there, so we're good. We're done here. It won't be like that. Get it on. If I use it for like say, yeah. Turn it on and it'll work it's like it takes a second
So once we get going, we've got how many suspensions? We got a minute here.
Oh, your relief is here anyhow.
Huh?
Your relief is here anyway.
Okay. Are you taking?
Pursuant to Clause 8, Rule 20, the Chair will postpone further proceedings today on motions to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered, or on which the vote incurs objection under Clause 6, Rule 20. Recorded votes on postponed questions will be taken later. What purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass S-25 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 25, an act to direct the Secretary of the Interior to convey certain federal features of the electric distribution system to the South Utah Valley Electric Service District and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick, and the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Smith, will each control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.